You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
You're listening to the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. Join me as we uncover the rich histories of North America's Great Plains, exploring the latest archaeological discoveries and past cultures that shape this storied region. Welcome to the podcast. Hey everyone, welcome to episode 12 of the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Carlton Shield Chief Gover, and I am thrilled to have you join me on this exciting journey through the rich and fascinating histories of North America's Great Plains. So for episode 12, this is going to be a bit of a somber episode. Not sure if it's going to take the whole 30 minutes. But today's episode, I want to remember a mentor of mine who recently passed away, and that would be Lance Foster of the Ioway Tribe of Kansas and Nebraska. Lance, it was kind of sudden for many of us that heard, and I really just want to take this time to spread the word about Lance for those that listen to this podcast or have an interest in Great Plains archaeology or tribal historic preservation. So Lance passed away in his sleep on January 12th of this year. It came as a shock to many of us when I read the text that I received from a colleague and friend of mine. Could hardly believe it because I was supposed to see Lance that Wednesday. A couple days later, we had plans with myself and Dr. Jennifer Raff of the University of Kansas. We were going to drive up to White Cloud, which is the headquarters for the Ioway Tribe of Kansas and Nebraska, to meet with Lance, who's the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Ioway up there, to talk about ADNA work and some questions that Lance had. And we were really excited to work with him and talk with him. And I don't want to get too much into it, but part of those conversations we had was he knew he was retiring soon and wanted to push the field in a different direction and do something cool on his way out. And it kind of sucked because I was really looking forward to seeing him. But so just to give you guys a background, Lance, he passed away at the age of 64. Lance was raised in Helena, Montana, where he graduated from Helena High School in 1978. He was an artist, among other things, and attended the Institute of American Indian Arts, and later earned a bachelor's degree from University of Montana at Missoula. Got his master's in anthropology and landscape architecture from Iowa State University, where he met, archaeology is a small field. He met some other soon to be, or later on in life, THPOs or tribal archaeologists, such as Karen Brunso from Chickasaw Nation when he was at Iowa. And he worked for the National Forest Service in Montana, also in Santa Fe, but he was also the director of Native Rights in Honolulu. But in 2013 is when he moved to White Cloud up in northern Kansas, on the Kansas-Nebraska border, where he became the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Ioway Tribe. He also served as the vice chair of the tribe for a bit. That was later on, I think early 2000s. And, I met Lance in person in 2019. I don't know if he was vice chair then or was just about to be. But he had actually awarded me, he was on the Native American Student Award Committee for the Plains Anthropological Society back in that time, and he was the one that gave me that award. But I met him in person in 2019 in Lincoln, Nebraska. I was there with a former field school student at the time, and History Nebraska, which is now, I think, just back to the Nebraska Historical Society. They had came out with a new exhibit with oral traditions, and Roger Echo Hawk did one for the Pawnee, and Lance was the other, but Lance was present. And I made a point to seek him out. He was really excited to talk to me, and we chatted for a bit as he was dealing with a lot of other folks, and that's what started it. And I kept in contact with Lance, and I'm just trying to set the stage. I don't want to make this about me because I want to talk about Lance here in a bit and kind of his impact that he had in Central Plains archaeology and working with archaeologists in NAGPRA and stuff. But Lance is one of the, when I was doing this online exhibit for Dr. Taylor at the University of Colorado Boulder, Lance is one of the THPOs we interviewed about horses. And so you can still go hear him speak for that exhibit if you go to that website, and I'll put it in the episode description. And he was great. He was a lot of fun. I remember when we were recording that, like in the middle of the recording, someone just like barged into his office and like threw something away in his trash can. And he was just like, what the heck, guys? It was just this funny moment. And then again, Lance, I hosted a session for the Plains Anthro Society. We did a forum. Essentially, it was on like the native effect, like the effects of NAGPRA and archaeology on Indigenous cultural heritage stewards and professionals. And so it was just Indigenous folks. And Lance was one that came out and he just spoke so eloquently. And that was like this long 3-hour session. It was bonkers. But Lance was there and stood up and gave really sage advice. I was like really appreciative of that. And we've like kept in contact. He was always like really active on Facebook too. Even up until the day he passed away. You know, me and Roger and I had invited him. We have this Facebook group chat, like page. It's called Pawnee Land. It's just for folks in the Pawnee Nation and around it. And Lance was like always a contributor, always bringing in Ioway perspectives. It was a blast to have him be a part of that. And one of the last things he posted Sunday night, at like 3:05 a.m. So the day he did who knows what happened. So he posted this early in the morning, and like a little bit later, he didn't wake up. And that was just one of those things. Like you'd go on Facebook in the mornings, and like I'd check my phone, and like Lance had been posting things in like the really wee hours in the morning, and it's just like, man, what is going on? You know, the last thing he said, or at least shared with everybody, was, I had this dream this night about many things, but in one, I was in a building or house and looking at windows, probably 3 or 4 stories up, kind of like the mission. And I was standing with 2 older Indian relatives, not people I know in waking life. We were looking down this town's parks, and there were these groups of young people in different kinds of almost reenactor units. And I realized they were kind of a combination of Civil War and medieval Crusader groups. They were getting themselves all whipped up into a frenzy. I was standing up there with those 2 older Indian lady relatives, and then looked out the other side of the windows, and there were 2 ravens in the tree there, and I started singing to them a song to the ravens. It was from one of our old stories, and it went, "Head crow, when I kill, you eat." That came out of me, but I don't remember the rest. And Roger Echo Hawk had put Lance's post and a picture of him with one of Lance's last drawings he shared with everybody on Facebook as a last thing. And Lance was just such a force, just such a force for a number of reasons. Like one, in archaeology, and even his job as a THPO, for like many of the things he did, like he was also an artist. And like help being part of the mission to turn the CAW mission, historic mission, into a museum and cultural center. Being so active as a tribal historic preservation officer, along with his deputy THPO, Daryl. Also knowing the language and revitalizing the language. He wrote a book on the Indians of Iowa too. And when I was like really excited when I took this KU job to actually be closer, not only to my own tribe, but like Lance was only 2 hours away. And I visited him, and he toured me around the res and the Leary site and the tribal national park that Lance helped to found. And like just his library was incredible. Like the amount of books they had up there. And one of the things I asked him when I arrived was, what are the books on the Ioway? And like, I didn't realize like how, the Pawnee, we do actually have a fair number of books about us. I mean, nowhere near like the Lakotas or some of those other like horse nomad groups, but the Ioway had like virtually nothing. And it was just kind of sad. But Lance knew so much, and Lance's Ioway name was Irogre, which is translates roughly to finds what is sought, which just seems like such a good name for him. And he was also someone like I can always go to Matt Reed or Marty Only Chief or the Pawnee. Do not get me wrong. But Lance was always someone I also went to very often to get that outside perspective. And he would always just lay it straight. And one of the things I remember calling him because I was like I whipped myself up in a tizzy over something, and Lance got me to chill out. And he was like, "Hey man, the most important thing is like things are going home, and you got to be in a good space to do that." And when we had this big old NAGPRA summit here at KU, with all these tribes, and Lance was there, and he was just such a calming presence. And he wasn't just calming to other Indians, but like to archaeologists and museum folks. Lance just had this, it was just incredible at bridging that gap or walking that line between being an archaeologist, an educated archaeologist, and being an Indigenous leader in tribal sovereignty. And he didn't get a PhD, and that's not something to regret. And something I've talked about definitely on A Life in Ruins, but maybe not so much here, is that more often than not, like the first tribal archaeologists don't end up becoming, PhDs or working at R1s. They get called back to their nation to serve in a capacity. And Lance was that. Lance was an early THPO in the Great Plains, in the Central Plains especially. And he was always wearing this like almost like fisherman's vest with all the pockets. He always had everything he needed. And, he just worked to protect his people and working with other tribes as well to the best of their abilities. And the way he worked with my tribe and how he could work with my NAGPRA officer, Marty Only Chief, and how he was a mentor to a lot of people, not only myself, but like other THPOs or NAGPRA officers. Like I made those calls that Monday when I heard the news from some Ioways, and these were Ioways that I knew weren't necessarily tuned into the archaeological community. So I was the one that I felt was responsible to make those calls to my friends and colleagues who knew Lance. And I wanted to make sure they heard about it before they found out on like a Facebook post. And man, that was rough. Like I knew the impact that Lance had on me. And to hear it from other people that I respect and who I learn from and who I look up to hear what they had to say about him and the impact he had. And I don't think I ever told Lance how much I respected him and looked up to him. And we got to the point, he started calling me nephew, and I started calling him uncle. In that Indian way, in that native way, we could talk about things and joke about things when it came to a lot of this stuff. And I'm really glad I got to be here at Kansas to get to see him. And I'm gonna take a break. I know I'm running over, but we'll be right back. I'm gonna go clean myself up. I'm sorry. We'll be right back with episode 12. And we're back. I apologize for getting a little emotional on that last bit. So I don't want to take up too much time. And we haven't totally got into like what a tribal historic preservation officer is. But for now, just know that, Lance was very much engaged in being a leader in NAGPRA repatriations in the Central Plains. And not only working in Kansas and Nebraska, but also Ioway ancestral territories before they got to Nebraska and Kansas, and like Iowa and beyond, and was very much a part of the ongoing negotiations with the pipestone pipeline that's going on, and, hearing some of the conversations and worries that are going on with that is just incredible. And if you want to read more about what a THPO does, and specifically what Lance did as a THPO, I'm going to put this link in the description below. Lance wrote this perspective piece for American Indian Magazine called This Far, No Farther, from winter of 2022. In one, Lance summed up what THPO work was. I think that last paragraph, tribal historic preservation officers often must seem to reflect the guardianship roles of those old warrior societies. Following rules, we unite to defend our lands and ancestors. Sometimes we have to plant a staff and say this far, no farther. And Lance really encapsulated that attitude of many THPOs and ACPR officers that I've come into play with, that they are really the front line of protecting tribal sovereignty as it comes to their ancestors and cultural heritage. Something that's not lost on myself and my colleagues in Indigenous archaeology, and something I try to tell my students a lot, that this just isn't a job, which came out of kind of dialing back to that forum I'd mentioned that Lance was a part of. Something that him and Mary Baker had mentioned, Mary Baker being at the time working for the Rickaras out of Mandan Hidatsa and Rickara out of the Dakotas, northern relative of mine. They expressed when talking to archaeologists, when you retire, or when you go home for the night, or when you're no longer an archaeologist, that stuff you do is behind you, that you can just hang up your hat, that's a job. But as Indigenous people in these roles, as THPOs and ACPR officers, even if they're not in the roles, what archaeologists, museum personnel do to their heritage still affects them. There's no decompressing, there's no getting away from it as an Indigenous person, that it still happens to them. They still feel the effects, and it's ongoing, and trying to really get it to people's heads about what archaeology and museums can, their effect on Indigenous people. So, man, I'm going to miss that, man. He was thinking about some cool stuff too. Some of the work that we had in play was really cutting edge stuff, and it's a bummer. And what really worries me is what happens now with his position, and what are the Ioway going to do? Whoever takes that role as THPO, so in their department, Lance and Daryl, they have a THPO and deputy THPO, and they split up the roles. So they don't have an official NAGPRA officer, but one of them is the NAGPRA officer kind of deal. Just what's going to happen. And I wasn't able to go to his memorial service, which is going to haunt me for a very long time. But Lance just really had an incredible impact. And at this point, I'm really just kind of babbling on. I kind of feel bad for taking that break, but for those that are interested in Kansas, Nebraska, and Iowa archaeology, you got to know Lance. Got to know Lance's work. He was pretty critical. He is pretty critical to the field there. I'm going to link his books, link his obituary. But Lance was just such a down-to-earth dude. Even though he was doing some pretty emotionally draining stuff, he was still had time for art, still had time to laugh and share stories and talk with people. He was just such an incredible mentor in so many different ways. And he will be missed. He will be missed. So with that, this has been episode 12 of the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. I'm sorry it wasn't a full-length episode. And this was a little bit of a downer topic. But I wanted to do right by Lance. I just wanted to talk to him for a bit and get out of my chest. So for everyone listening, there's someone important in your life or a good mentor, might be a good time to reach out to him. Just let him know. Just thinking about him. So with that, I'll see you all next time. Thank you for listening to the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. You can follow me on Instagram at Pawnee_archaeologist, and you can also email me at greatplainsarchpodcast@gmail.com. And remember, anybody can love the mountains, but it takes a soul to love the prairie. American author Willa Cather.
The Archaeology Podcast Network is 10 years old this year. Our executive producer is Ashley Airy, our social media coordinator is Matilda Siebrecht, and our chief editor is Rachel Roden. The Archaeology Podcast Network was co-founded by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle in 2014 and is part of Cultural Media and DigTech LLC.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.